Now we're going to focus on efforts to stop this genocide in its tracks, and that's what we're going to talk about with our next guest. I'll just remind everyone that you're watching and listening to the Electronic Intifada live stream. I'm Ali Abu Ni'ma, here with my colleague Nora Barrows-Friedman. After 22 months of unprecedented carnage, three things are clear. First, the Israeli regime will not end the genocide in Palestine of its own will. Second, the US government, Israel's principal collaborator, as well as the majority of Israelis and the regime's proxies and lobbies in the West, are fully committed to this genocide and to the destruction and erasure of every remnant of Palestine from the river to the sea. And third, other Western governments like the UK and Germany, as well as far too many complicit Arab states in the region, are fully dedicated to the cause of Israeli impunity. Those are the words of international human rights lawyer Gerard Mokhiber in an article he wrote late last month for Mondoweiss, headlined, "How the UN Could Act Today to Stop the Genocide in Palestine." Gerard Mokhiber is supporting an initiative to force Israel to stop the genocide in Gaza using the UN's Uniting for Peace mechanism. Craig and I both spoke in an online seminar about this initiative last week, chaired by Dr. Jill Stein. We were, of course, joined by many other incredible speakers, and I believe that's online if you want to watch it. Under the initiative, the UN General Assembly would act by denying Israel's credentials, calling for sanctions and a military embargo, establishing a criminal tribunal, reactivating the UN's anti-apartheid mechanisms, and mandating a UN protection force to protect civilians and facilitate aid, as well as to preserve evidence of Israeli war crimes. We're going to talk about all this and more with Gerard Mokhiber, who joins us live now.
Hi, Craig.
Hi, Craig.
Hi, Nora. Hi, Ali. Nice to be with you again.
Welcome back to the Electronic Intifada live stream. Craig, before we get onto some of those topics, let's start with your reaction to Israel's air attack on Doha, the Qatari capital, on Tuesday. Israel said it was intended to kill the Hamas negotiating team led by senior figure Khalil al-Hayya. Hamas said that al-Hayya survived, but the attack killed 6 people, including al-Hayya's son and an aide and a Qatari citizen. Israel itself reportedly acknowledged to the US on Wednesday that the attack failed to kill Hamas's senior leaders. Meanwhile, on Wednesday, Yemen's Al Masira TV reported that Israeli strikes targeted a health facility in Sana'a and a government building in the Al Hazm district. There have also been reports in the last 24 hours of Israeli attacks on other Yemeni civilian targets, including media outlets, killing and injuring dozens of people. And of course, at the end of August, Israeli attacks on Sana'a, the Yemeni capital, killed Yemen's Prime Minister Ahmed al-Rahawi and almost a dozen other ministers and senior officials, scarcely even generating any international headlines. Israel has also reportedly been attacking boats in Tunisia that are part of the international flotilla trying to break the siege on Gaza. Craig, I know that's a lot, but I just want to get your reaction to these actions by Israel.
Well, you know, Ali, once again, this is one of those acts that reminds us that what the Israeli regime is doing with its American partner principally is not just attacking Palestine and Palestinians, it's attacking the entire world. It's attacking the international legal framework. It's attacking the international diplomatic framework. You know, rule number 1 of diplomacy is you don't murder your diplomatic counterparts, right? I mean, this was a team that was in Qatar to negotiate a ceasefire. This was an attack on a residential and diplomatic quarter in Doha. And, you know, it's so typical of Israel. This was a treacherous, a perfidious crime. This reminds us of the murder of Nasrallah in Beirut, who was there having agreed to a ceasefire when the Israelis murdered him. And then, you know, we all remember the US-Israeli attack on Iran, where they pretended to be negotiating in order to carry out a sneak attack, just as they did in this case. And I think what it shows us is that there's nothing more threatening to the Israeli regime than negotiations and a possible ceasefire, because they see this as an inconvenient obstacle to what their plans are now, what their plans have always been. which is the total destruction of Gaza, the total destruction of Palestine, and completing its genocide there. It does not want a ceasefire. Now, as an international lawyer, I'm compelled to say this was a serious violation of international law. It was the crime of aggression under the UN Charter. It's a grave breach of international humanitarian law, gross violation of international human rights law, the crime of murder. But very much, as I'm saying, an attack on international law itself and on the idea of diplomacy. So how does Israel do this? Israel does this because this is the product of decades of impunity, guaranteed by the US, guaranteed by our tax dollars. And Israel, because of that sense of impunity, it doesn't deny its crimes, it brags about them, right? It was also, I have to say, a clear case of US complicity. It's so funny to watch these corporate reporters talking to Trump and to people in the administration about what he knew and what he could have done and so on. This is all part of the greater show. This was U.S. complicity. The U.S. drew negotiators to Qatar with a kind of a loosely drafted non-proposal. It armed the assassins. It almost certainly greenlit their killings, and it stood down U.S. air defenses that are based in Qatar, allowing the strikes to take place on their own allies. And why I think that's important is because it reveals, again, if they need more evidence of this, the Faustian nature of this deal that the Gulf states have entered into with the U.S.-Israel access, where they've sacrificed their sovereignty, they've sacrificed their economies, they've sacrificed their honor. They're hosting U.S. military bases, the biggest one of all, in Qatar, normalizing with the Israeli regime even as it perpetrates a genocide. And they're doing this with the expectation that means they'll be safe from the ravages of the U.S. empire. Of course, it was always going to end badly for them, but I don't think any of them expected that they'd be thrown under the bus by the U.S. so quickly, standing down its military defenses in Qatar. And I think if they don't respond in a meaningful way, they're all going to need to brace themselves for this to continue as the new normal, or as Netanyahu says, the new Middle East as he sees it. Just one more thing I want to say about this is that there is a tendency in the media to talk about these things as incidents, disconnected incidents. But you don't have to zoom back very far to see that what's happening here is an assault on the region and on the world. Genocide in Palestine, occupying territory in Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria. The transnational terror attacks in Lebanon with booby-trapped pagers, attacks on Iran and Syria and Lebanon and Yemen. This attack on humanitarian boats in Tunisia just in the last couple of days, and its extension of its proxies in our own countries in the West to attack students and academics and human rights defenders and peace activists, even as it builds its nuclear stockpiles, as it supports with technology and weapons the most oppressive regimes all around the world, as it surveils all of us with its technology, and as it spends billions of dollars to spread its racist ideology all around the world. It is hard to understand how ordinary people are not able to see the seriousness of the threat that is facing us. This is our 1930s moment, and yet the world is sitting on its hands and not responding to this collective of horrors that is being perpetrated on it, all because of the impunity that's been afforded to the Israeli regime by the US and other Western partners now for decades. And let's hope this is some kind of a wake-up call to the countries in the Gulf and to the countries more broadly in Western Asia. We'll see.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the Uniting for Peace mechanism. In your article for Mondo Weiss that we referenced earlier, you argue that the UN can bypass an inevitable US Security Council veto and actually act to materially force Israel to stop the genocide using this mechanism. Explain very simply what that is and why you think it's worth the effort to try and use it right now, especially when so many international mechanisms seem to have been completely paralyzed or have failed. The so-called international rules-based order, as you said, is it's rotting. I mean, it's nothing. It's completely gone at this point.
Yeah, well, it's being pulled apart piece by piece and by design. That there's no question about it. But the world as it is now, the only universal intergovernmental organization is the United Nations, and the United Nations has good parts and bad parts. It has some very good parts in the heroic UNRWA colleagues, 360 of them who've been murdered by the Israelis during this current wave of genocide, many along with their families, independent human rights mechanisms that have been documenting and speaking out and doing advocacy, like Francesca Albanese, who has not only received death threats and harassment everywhere she goes, but US sanctions for doing so. There are parts of the UN that are good and that are helping to serve the cause. And I don't think we want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but as we've discussed on this show before, the political side of the House is failing miserably. And part of it is failing by design. That's the Security Council, which was created by the powerful victors of World War II to give themselves the veto to prevent anything meaningful from happening that they didn't agree with. That's the imperial piece. That's a disaster, but that's a disaster by design, right? So you have a lot of states who like to throw up their arms and say, well, we tried, but the Americans vetoed it. And what we're saying is there are things that can be done to get around that veto. And the most obvious one is this thing called the Uniting for Peace resolution. This resolution, this Cold War relic from 1950, that actually gives the General Assembly, which is the democratic body, the body where there's no veto and where every country in the world has a vote, one vote, that it actually is empowered by Uniting for Peace to act when the Security Council is blocked by a veto. And it has done so in the past. In 1956, it mandated the UN Emergency Force, which was deployed to the Sinai during the height of the Suez Crisis, against the wishes of both the French and the British, who had vetoes in the Security Council, against the wishes of the Israelis. And it actually managed to deploy a force there to help to respond to the Suez crisis. The Uniting for Peace resolution has been used several times since, including with regard to Palestine, including during the current genocide, but always just for symbolic resolutions that called for a ceasefire and humanitarian aid and all those sort of things, but without any practical measures. And what we're saying is that legally and with a precedent and with all the powers that they need, the UN General Assembly, without the fear of the US veto, could adopt a resolution under Uniting for Peace with specific actions. It could declare economic and diplomatic and political sanctions against the Israeli regime. It can't enforce them, but it can adopt them, it can monitor them, it can expand them, it can give a multilateral diplomatic cover to all countries to advance those sanctions. It could do the same with a military embargo. It could demand the withdrawal of Israel's UN General Assembly credentials, as was done with South Africa during the apartheid regime. It could establish a criminal tribunal to actually bring cases against Israeli perpetrators at all levels. Great that the ICC has made some modest movement in there. Great that the ICJ is addressing genocide. But what you need is a much more massive response to a massive set of crimes being perpetrated by Israel, not just to hold them accountable in the future, but to ratchet up the sense of deterrence against these perpetrators, and not just those who would shelter in Israel, but those who are dual nationals and who are flying back and forth, participating in the genocide, and then walking the streets of our own cities as well. And it could reactivate the UN's anti-apartheid mechanisms that were one small but important piece of the struggle against the South African regime as well. And then finally, what it could do, and it could do this, it could adopt a mandate for a multinational protection force to be deployed to Palestine with a specific mandate to protect civilians, to facilitate humanitarian aid, to preserve evidence of Israeli crimes, and to begin the process of recovery and reconstruction. There are no legal hurdles to this. It's entirely possible. There is a tradition of enough of a voting margin. We'd need 2/3 in the General Assembly. In other historic resolutions there, all of those things are possible. And we are at a historic moment here, not only because of the situation on the ground where much of the world is waking up and saying, wait a minute, this really is genocide. Wait a minute, they are starving them to death. Wait a minute, they are massacring civilians. But that there was a deadline that was set by the General Assembly a year ago that will expire on about the 18th of September, in just a matter of a few days, at which, if Israel has not complied with the findings of the International Court of Justice, it has not. If it has not complied with the demands of the UN General Assembly, it has not. The General Assembly has said it will adopt further measures. Now, the risk is those further measures will either be meaningless, like another resolution calling for a ceasefire, or some other rhetorical thing, or potentially damaging, like this idea being circulated by the French and the Saudis of a so-called stabilization force, which will do, in my view, more harm than good, or that it won't act. And in that vacuum, you'll see something emerge like the mad delusions of President Trump and his so-called great occupation of Palestine to be one big casino in a kind of private occupation that we haven't seen since King Leopold claimed to own the Congo and used it for his own economic benefit. This is the one proposal which is not based upon a Chapter 7 mandate to be imposed against the will of the Palestinians, which is not a proxy occupation force, which is not something that comes after the genocide has been concluded, but which could be deployed now against considerable hurdles that we can talk about, but which could be deployed now to actually protect Palestinians from genocide as it is happening. And in the past, this has not happened because these kinds of conversations take place in the shadows of Turtle Bay, in the back rooms of the UN in New York City. And what we are trying to do is to drive this conversation into the light of public scrutiny, where states that rhetorically, we're not trying to convince the Americans and the Israelis or their little puppet regimes in the South Pacific or a couple of far-right regimes that might vote with them. We're trying to tell the rest of the world, you have to now tell the world under the light of day that you either say yes or you say no to a protection force that could be deployed to Palestine to save the lives of a people facing extermination. And the hope is that that will, to some degree, change the political calculus, change the incentive structure under which these delegations behave and these countries behave in multilateral fora like the UN, to get to the first step where all they have to do is to adopt this resolution. Now, this, I want to say before I shut up and listen to questions, this does not replace the long-term strategy for Palestinian liberation. This is something that is a very short-term move to get immediate protection now, and it relies upon all of us to continue the struggle for boycott and divestment and sanctions and prosecutions and education and civil disobedience and public demonstrations, and all of that has to continue as it did in the long-term struggle in South Africa. It needs to continue in the long-term struggle for the liberation of Palestine. But what do we do right now? And the answer is only resistance by the Palestinian people, steadfastness by the Palestinian public, solidarity from the rest of us and ratcheting up that solidarity in all of our actions. But what about intervention? If there's going to be an intervention, this is the one that operates with the consent of the Palestinian people, with a specific mandate that doesn't stick its nose into issues of Palestinian governance or the role of Hamas or the role of the PA. It merely says, which by the way is none of the business of the UN. That's up to the Palestinian people. It merely says, we're going to deploy this force, and in this force, you're going to have, I mean, imagine Spanish, Irish, Slovenian, South African, Namibian, Colombian, Brazilian, Indonesian, Malaysian, all of these contingents sent from countries entering by land, sea, air, under an international mandate, not as an invasion and combat force, but as an armed protection force for the Palestinian people. There's a chance, not 100%, not a panacea, but there is a chance to use a power that exists to intervene to save lives. And all we're asking, tell us one by one, 193 countries, yes or no to protecting Palestine from annihilation. And if you say no, then you have revealed yourself, not just to the world, but to your own people, and suffer the consequences then.
Thanks, Craig. That's a great explanation of what you have in mind. I was going to ask you about, you do a good job of this in your Mondoweiss article and also in the seminar that you and I were both part of the other day, in explaining why this international force is not like some of the others we've seen mandated by the UN, which are really a cover for US imperialism, or are there actually to protect Israel from its victims, as we've seen with some of the other types of UN or international forces that have been talked about. This would be something different. You can say something about that if you want to, although I feel you've addressed it to an extent. But what really I want to push you on is, how realistic is all this? You've argued already, and convincingly, that states do not need any further UN resolution to act to stop Israel's genocide. They have all the authorization they need, including for military action. And indeed, they have the legal obligation to act under the UN Genocide Convention. But only a few countries have done anything at all. Why would a Uniting for Peace resolution make a difference when what is clearly missing here is not legal cover, but political will? How much support are you seeing for a United for Peace resolution now, when the UN General Assembly convenes later this month in New York? And also a question that I see people asking in the comments is, there's lots of people who want to lend their support to this. How can ordinary people who are watching and listening to us today, help to push this process forward? So a challenge, and also how can we do it?
Yeah, there's a lot in there. Well, first, you're right that any country can legally intervene, either individually or collectively with others, to stop this genocide and these grave breaches of international humanitarian law. And as I have written, these are obligations. Those obligations already exist. They don't need anything further to do so. But we all know that in concrete terms, the only government that has done so has been the Ansar Allah government in Yemen, which has intervened as being mercilessly attacked for doing so, right? Others, I think that there is a sincere outrage at what is happening, but most states behave in very conservative ways. And the argument here is that if you provided a multinational mandate from the United Nations that provides diplomatic cover, political cover, some legal strengthening of the case, other states may be willing to step forward in a way that they're not willing to expose themselves to simply go and attack the Israeli regime unilaterally. So this provides further incentive. As I said, all of this is about changing the incentive structure, changing the political calculus to the extent that we have the power to do so, so that almost universal inaction could be turned not into universal action, but some action from some countries. And there is support. Some of the most vocal voices have been the president of Ireland. And the president of Ireland doesn't command Irish foreign policy in the way that presidents in other countries do, but it's not unimportant. And there's a lot of, as you know, Ali, having just returned, there was a lot of support in Ireland as well for these kinds of initiatives. But, others, such as the president of Colombia, who have not only spoken out in support of this, but have already begun action around this question, and still others who you would expect to step forward within the Hague group, for example. All you need is one country to ask for this. But in order to push it through, you would need a group of so-called co-sponsors. So a group, ideally a cross-regional group of countries that have said the right things and begun to take action in Europe, in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, and so on, to shepherd it through in the General Assembly. It is entirely possible. It's only a question of political will. And of course, the elephant in the room is the United States, as always, or the elephant in the china shop is the United States, because of course it will do everything that it can, lawfully and unlawfully, to try to first prevent the adoption of the resolution, and second, to try to prevent its implementation. But the first part, the adoption of the resolution, that's entirely possible. Not easy, but that's a diplomatic challenge that I think could be overcome if, and I'll just repeat it again, if we can get the conversation into the light enough that delegations aren't hiding in the shadows and taking the easy way out, which is a rhetorical resolution that condemns Israel and calls for a ceasefire. If we can force it into the light and force them to answer this specific question of a protection force, then that helps to change that political calculus. Then you have the question of what happens once the force is trying to deploy, and that is far from guaranteed. But, you know, a force of contingents made up of Spanish and Irish and Slovenian and South African and Namibian and Kenyan and Colombian and Brazilian and Malaysian and Indonesian contingents sailing under the UN flag it's not a slam dunk that even a ruthless regime like the Israelis, who have attacked UN peacekeepers in Lebanon, who have murdered UN staff in Gaza, it's not obvious that they would then be in a position to directly attack those forces coming with a specific mandate not to engage in battle with the Israelis, but to provide protection in Gaza, where, by the way, the International Court of Justice has affirmed Israel has no say. It has no sovereignty, it has no authority, it has no rights in Gaza or the West Bank, and it has no say in this question legally. So that changes, I think, the political calculus somewhat, and potentially, if it's accompanied by, imagine this force coming in, accompanied by massive diplomatic pressure from across regions, accompanied by international media, accompanied by global movements, shining the light on this process as well. There are no guarantees with a regime like the Israeli regime, or frankly, a regime like the Trump regime. But it does change the political calculus. And then imagine that they deploy, but they don't get in. This is also a very significant ratcheting up of the political and diplomatic pressure. It is a push for an even better alignment of states if Israel dares to obstruct or to block this action. And it's still not guaranteed, but people have talked about sending a protection force to Palestine for decades. The stars have never been aligned as they are now, both because of the situation on the ground and because of the deadline and the ratcheting up of pressure and the demands coming from the people that watch this show and the people in movements all around the world, and particularly in the West. There's never been a chance that is good as it is now, which is at best a 50% chance. And there will not be in the future a chance as good as this. And we can't leave a vacuum to be filled by the mad fantasies of Donald Trump and Kushner and Tony Blair, who they dug up in some crypt and have involved in this process of Trump's planning as well, if we have an opportunity to do this. And, you know, if we ask for it and they don't do it, it's their sin. If we don't ask for it, it's our sin, right? We can't leave any, as I've said, arrows in the quiver when we're fighting extermination. We have to use everything that we have. And here's the last thing I'll say on this. Either the UN will do this after 2 years of sitting on its hands in a live-streamed genocide, something it was established to address these kinds of atrocities and aggression and the kind of behavior that the Israeli regime is engaged with, not just in Palestine, but across Western Asia and beyond. Either they will use what they have, the powers that they have, and take the action that they're supposed to take, or it will absolutely be the beginning of the end of these institutions, whose credibility is already hanging by a thread, whose legitimacy is already hanging by a thread. You can't blame the US veto in the Security Council if you have another option and you choose not to take it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the credibility of these international bodies is it's very little. Craig, the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio recently denied visas to the leaders of the Palestinian Authority, including Mahmoud Abbas, to attend the UN General Assembly, you know, proving that no matter how much you capitulate to the enemy, you say that the security of Israel is sacred, the security cooperation of the PA is sacred, you'll still get punished by Israel and the US. And leaving aside the issue about the legitimacy of Abbas as a leader and of the PA's complicity in Israel's occupation and other crimes, what has the UN's reaction been, and what should it what should it be to this gross interference by the host country, who can, who can and cannot attend? And then to that end, the U.S. State Department just levied sanctions against 3 major human rights organizations in Palestine that have been meticulously documenting Israel's crimes and creating, files and files and files that have been sent to the ICJ and the ICC. And then, of course, Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, is not lifting a finger to do any of the measures that the UN, as you said, was established to do in times of occupation and genocide and ruthless ethnic cleansing. How do you see these kind of 3 newsy items fitting together? What does this say about how much stake people should be putting in the UN at the top levels to hold anybody accountable at this point?
Well, we have to try. I mean, absolutely, we have to try, and we have to keep the pressure on. I mean, you've heard my critique of the UN Secretary General and the political leadership of the UN, over and over again. I think they were the wrong people at this moment in history, and they're going to have to live with their abdication, with their failures as well. I mean, this blocking of visas by the United States, I mean, this is an absolutely lawless government. We know that this is unlawful because, this is a breach of U.S. treaty obligations. The UN host country agreement with the United States is a treaty. It is binding law, and it is being ignored, just as the UN Convention on Privileges and Immunities is being breached by the United States in doing so. They don't care. This is an absolutely lawless government, right? And they know very well that Palestine is going to be the centerpiece of this 80th session of the UN General Assembly. That there's going to be a discussion on the 2-state solution. There are going to be interventions on the genocide in Palestine. There are going to be a number of states that are announcing their recognition of Palestine. There are going to be a number of reports received on Palestine from the Secretary General and from the High Commissioner of Human Rights and from agencies and others. The very centerpiece of this session of the General Assembly is Palestine. And so, in obsequious performance of the commands of the Israeli regime, the U.S. government is doing all it can in this very childish way, I have to say, to try to block the participation of the Palestinian delegation at this moment. So, without regard to the legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority, its overlap with the state of Palestine and with the PLO these days, all of that, the state of Palestine has a legal right to participate in all of this. And how do you talk about Palestine without Palestinians? That's the repeated U.S. sin over and over again. So it's an absurdity. And by the way, the U.S. government has granted a visa to al-Jolani of Syria, who is still on the U.S. terrorism list. But they don't grant a visa to their ally in Ramallah, right? So you can see the madness of this, and particularly when the centerpiece of this session is going to be Palestine. Now, there's a precedent from 1988. People will recall that the U.S. Tried to block Yasser Arafat from coming to address the UN General Assembly. At that moment, they got slapped down very badly, the United States, because the entire UN General Assembly agreed to move the session to Geneva, Switzerland, in order to allow Yasser Arafat to address the UN General Assembly. That was another time when the U.S. Further isolated and marginalized itself, did no harm to Palestine in the process. To the contrary, heightened the prestige of the Palestinian delegation in doing so. In this case, there has so far been no move to move the General Assembly to Geneva, although there are conversations behind the scenes. A part of that conversation is that they don't need to do so because there is a resident Palestinian delegation in New York that will be able to attend, and they have modern technology that wasn't available in 1988 to have the senior Palestinian delegation also address the General Assembly. I still think they should move to Geneva. I think the whole UN, it's long overdue to get it out of New York. It's not in the interest of the UN to be in the belly of the beast as it is. But even if they don't do so, they're not going to be able to silence the Palestinian voice. There will be Palestinian participation and people speaking on behalf of Palestine as well. And has the UN Secretary General done enough? Well, it is his job in the UN to try to make sure that the headquarters agreement is respected, the host country agreement is expected. So far, all of this has been happening behind the scenes with his spokesperson indicating that there are conversations going on with the host government, and we hope that they will respect it and so on. The General Assembly opened on the 9th of September, but the high-level week, the so-called general debate with the heads of state and heads of government, that's not until the 23rd to the 29th of September. So there could be further moves between now and then, but this is a very, very clear breach. And here's just the last thing I'll say on this. You know, the idea that, for example, the French and the Saudis would go ahead with their two-state solution conversations, as crazy as that is, in any event, without the senior Palestinian delegation present, this is not a solution for anything. This has been the problem of international diplomacy when it comes to Palestine. I hope that won't be the case.
Mm.
Well, Craig, you know, you said so many things there that I agree with. I mean, I'll just say for me personally, I don't recognize the Palestinian Authority or its legitimacy to represent Palestinians anywhere. They have their claim to represent Palestinians is null and void as far as I'm concerned, particularly as they collaborate with the genocidal regime murdering Palestinians. So I don't look at this as being about Palestinian representation. I don't consider them Palestinian representation. But I look at this from the perspective of what the UN claims to be, this world body that represents the world and that should be sovereign and should not be subordinate to Marco Rubio deciding which world leaders can and cannot attend. So, I mean, if the whole UN General, if the reason for not moving to Geneva is that, well, Mahmoud Abbas can join us by Zoom, then no one needs to come to New York. The whole thing can be done on Zoom. In other words, to me, it's shocking that Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, hasn't even commented on this publicly. I've been checking almost every day. I've seen nothing from him. And as you say, it all seems to be going on behind the scenes. And so it seems to me that by not moving it, they are acquiescing to the State Department deciding who can and can't come. I don't know if you want to say anything else about that, and then we'll let you go. But I just want to get your final comment about that aspect, Craig.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think not only should they move the session, the 80th session to Geneva, absolutely they should, because it's also important to make sure that the U.S. suffers the marginalization and isolation that it deserves when it makes these sorts of unlawful moves. That would be a very, very powerful signal. But the UN needs to get the hell out of New York permanently. You know, I worked in the UN in various duty stations, including in New York, and I can tell you that the worst host country on the planet is the United States for the UN. The atmosphere, the smears that come directly from the US government against UN personnel, harassment of people, delegates, and staff by immigration that you don't experience in other countries that host the UN. The massive financial costs for operating in New York City. And by the way, the UN brings billions of dollars in revenues to New York just by being there. So the US is benefiting and the UN is not. The prestige that it gets, the diplomatic access that the US gets, all of that it gets, in return, it sanctions UN officials unlawfully. It harasses them. It presents risks to their safety by firing up these sort of far-right anti-UN voices and so on. So the UN does not belong in New York. The UN belongs, if you simply say the UN is moving, you can bet the bidding war amongst other countries in the world. And I would love to see it be somewhere in the global south and a bit more insulated from the machinations of the US empire. but anywhere else would be better. And you can bet there would be a huge bidding war offering things to the UN to move to countries from Europe, from Africa, and beyond. So it should move. I mean, Palestinian representation absolutely should never be left to the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority technically has no voice in the UN. Foreign policy is supposed to be the business of the PLO, and the state of Palestine is the voice in the UN. The problem, of course, is the Venn diagram, where all of those things now overlap with the same personalities and the same power structures. I mean, that's for the Palestinian people to resolve. But I think there are a lot of folks in the world, especially in the world of international diplomacy, that would like to see the PLO become the PLO again. So this problem could be avoided. I don't know if I didn't say anything about the sanctions on the Palestinian human rights organizations. I didn't mean nor to skip over that, but I know we're short on time, so I'm in your hands.
Yeah. Well, we'll come back and talk about this and other things, Craig. Just we're very grateful for all the analysis you do. I mentioned the article on Mondoweiss that gives people a lot of background on this Uniting for Peace initiative. I think it's an excellent primer. And then is there anywhere else people can go to find out more, Craig? Or is your article a good starting point?
I think it's a good starting point. There are a lot of organizations now that have come together to try to push this forward. And there's a day of global action that's been called on the 18th of September. But this is an immediate term need. So anyone who wants to act on this, if we get to the 18th of September or a few days thereafter, and there hasn't been movement within the General Assembly on this, then we're going to know pretty well that, we haven't been able to mobilize the political will that's necessary. This is a short-term campaign. There are demonstrations planned in capitals around the world and in front of the UN, at least on the 18th and perhaps even before then, so folks can get involved. They can find information for that on my Twitter X feed, and with all the organizations that are involved. At least a dozen organizations and movements are now involved in this process, all centered on Palestinian civil society organizations that are in the lead, and the rest of us are working in solidarity with them.
Great.
Incredible.
Thank you so much, Craig. We'll be following it, and we look forward to having you back again soon. And in the meantime, we will continue to follow all your incredible analysis. Thank you so much, Craig.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Nora, so much.
Thank you. Always an honor.